Hello, everyone. Welcome. Happy Thursday. Welcome to WOTS Weekly Features. Today's guests are Selena Middleton, Kern, and Cynthia Zhang from Stelliform Press. We'll be talking about climate fiction, speculative fiction, and queerness. I'm Yali, and I'll be your host. WOTS Toronto operates on land that is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. This territory is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Anishinaabeg and Allied Nations to care for and share the resources around the Great Lakes in peace. We encourage you to educate yourself about the land that you live on, wherever you're tuning in from. All right, so now for our guests. Selena Middleton is the publisher and editor-in-chief at Stelliform Press. She has a PhD in English literature, focusing on feminist, ecological science fiction, and writes climate fiction and other speculative fictions as Eileen Gunnell Lee. Her stories have been published in Escape Pod, Little Blue Marble, Celine Quarterly, and Nightmare Magazine. She is an active member of the SFWA, the SFRA, Codex Writers, and Editors Canada. Thank you so much for joining us, Selena.
Thank you, Yeli. So happy to be here.
Yeah. All right, so our next guest is Kern. Sim is an environmental journalist and speculative fiction writer exploring intersections of climate change, queerness, and social justice. Their quiet horror novella, Depart, debuted from Stelliform Press in 2020. You can find links to all their stories at simkern.com. Welcome, Sim. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Yeli. Glad to be here.
And Cynthia Zhang, last but not least, is a PhD student in comparative studies in literature and culture at the University of Southern California. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Kaleidotrope, On Spec, Phantom Drift, and other venues. A 2021 DV debut mentee, her debut novel, After the Dragons, is out in 2021 with Stelliform Press. Thank you so much, Cynthia, for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Awesome. It's so nice to just see all your faces and be in conversation. I'm so excited. All right, so maybe to kick us off, for Selena specifically, could you tell us a little bit about Stelliform and specifically the climate and culture focus of it?
Yeah, sure. So really Stelliform it springs from my PhD research, and that research was on ecological fiction, though I started with just focusing on climate fiction. And when I was doing the lit review for that, I was seeing a lot of focus on technology to the detriment of character and the ways that ecological changes will influence the kinds of relationships we'll have with each other, the kinds of feelings that will dominate our lives, and also what we're going to do with those feelings. So I found that the kinds of stories I was most interested in were happening in the 70s and 80s feminist science fiction, and then more recently in Black and Indigenous futurism. And those stories are really demonstrating an awareness of interrelationality that I'm interested in. And those are the kinds of stories that I want to bring into the climate fiction conversation. Because in order for us to have real change around climate, Western affluent culture needs to change, and it needs to be able to see itself from another perspective. So that's what I'm hoping to accomplish with Stelliform. As for what speculative fiction has to do with that idea of cultural change, we've seen that really forever in myth and fairy tale. And those stories have always been about the structures of society, the rules that we live by, that kind of thing. So I want to see contemporary retellings or genre mashups using those old stories, or bringing technology or the technology element into conversation with those old stories. And yeah, that's something that really appeals to me. And I think it's a way to get to the root of the problem and change the ways that people are thinking about climate.
For sure. I love what you said about viewing our own world from a different perspective. I think that's a very, very cool kind of thesis to play with.
Yeah, absolutely.
So speaking of these climate fiction novels, Sim and Cynthia, could you tell us a little bit about your books and how climate and culture play a role in those books as well? I don't know which one of you wants to go first.
Do I go first because I'm more recent?
Sure, go for it.
Okay, you can go first on the next one then.
Sounds good.
Yeah, just in terms of my book, After the Dragons is about dragons, as the book vaguely suggests, but kind of also living in the aftermath of sort of a once epic world. It's about two kids who are vaguely college aged or just post college. They meet in Beijing, where there are a lot of urban dragons that are not well taken care of because they're seen as either abandoned pests or kind of like urban animals, a la raccoons, etc. And they meet over and bond over this idea of animal welfare and just like family trauma, etc. In terms of, I think in climate, this book was really inspired by some of my childhood family trips home to Beijing and just being in a city where sometimes the sky was really hazy and you couldn't always see the sun. I think it's gotten better in recent years, but that improvement has been very much along this, lines of repressive sort of like government policies, etc. Like Beijing as a city can clean itself up, but it does so mostly when there are like big public events where it has to be on the global stage. So I guess I see it as just like, what if it's essentially in our world, but the dials are up just a little bit more, and there's just a little bit more. We have like cultural narratives that, of course, are still haunting us in all over the world, and here they're just made a little bit more literal, I think. And in terms of culture, I think like one of my characters is mixed race Black Asian, and the other one is he's like Chinese in the sense that he lives in Asia at the moment. And I wanted to play with the idea of like, maybe what exactly does it mean to belong to a place, culture as inheritance, but something that can also evolve, expand, and can be more fluid than like what we normally think of when we think of the term Asian American.
Sure.
On to Sim.
Thanks, Cynthia. And by the way, Cynthia's book is great. I just finished it and it's wonderful and everyone should read it. So my book, Depart to Part, is set in Houston, it's actually mostly set in Dallas, but it's set in the aftermath of a catastrophic hurricane hitting Houston. Mm-hmm. And so the climate aspect is actually very autobiographical because I wrote this book with like all the trauma that I had from living through Hurricane Harvey. Wow. And many of the experiences in the book are drawn directly from things that happened to me or my friends during Hurricane Harvey. And it didn't take that much of an exaggeration to realize also we got lucky with Hurricane Harvey. We keep getting lucky. And if the wrong storm comes along, if Harvey had been a Cat 5 instead of a Cat 4, if the dams to the west of the city that almost failed had failed, there would have been a much greater catastrophe. And so I just kind of wanted to, take those fears that I have and write that up as a fictional warning, because we have plenty of great journalists in the city who are sounding those alarms in the papers. But I wanted to put those sort of fears into fiction. And then in terms of culture, when I was living through Hurricane Harvey, that was like months before I came out as trans. And because of the hurricane, we ended up staying with my in-laws, who are extremely transphobic and queerphobic and, Trumpers. And so my queerness, it felt like I was in this very hostile environment. And so I was thinking a lot about, queer identity, trans identity, and how that impacts survivors of climate crises. And then the book also, it brought up a lot of, I think, intergenerational trauma that I have as a Jewish person that was transmitted, through my grandparents to me, and just in the forms of like a constant nagging fear in the back of your head and fear of sort of neighbors who will be hostile to you. And so I brought that into the book in the form of a ghost. So the main character, Noah, is being haunted by the ghost of his great-grandfather, Abe, who was a Holocaust survivor. And I think that having lived through now a number of different climate crises here in Houston, every time one happens, it triggers all your traumas, not just your climate trauma that you've had because the city has flooded and frozen and been hit by hurricanes, but also any cultural trauma or queer trauma or any other racial trauma that you would bring like into that moment.
Totally. It sounds like both of your works are very much rooted in real life, even though they are in these kind of speculative worlds. It's very interesting to see play out. So, Sim, you already mentioned this a little bit, but as kind of a general, idea question, in what ways do queer fiction and queer identity kind of overlap with climate fiction and in ecological justice and all of those good things? And Selena, you're free to answer as well if you'd like.
One way I think they overlap is like common enemies, right? Like
totally.
People that are really hostile to any conversation of climate change, who are standing in the way of progress on climate change, are also, politically tend to be homophobic and transphobic and using us as cultural, points to score in the legislatures. So I think we have a common enemy, and I think that's, I think that's one unifying thing. And on the flip side, I think that queer people are more likely to be tapped into the language of social justice, the concerns of like a broader leftist movement and concerns, which includes being very concerned about climate change. And when it comes time for like a climate crisis, trans people have to navigate the world and keep ourselves safe in sort of a bubble. We find bubbles that we live in where we feel safe. Living in Texas, being inside the inner loop of Houston, I always feel safe, like moving around and stuff. When we go on road trips and I'm leaving the city, that's when I worry about like walking into a women's restroom, or which restroom am I going to go into? Are people going to say something to me? They often have in the past. So that can, those fears become, when you're in a climate crisis, you get pushed out of your like safe little bubble, and that can be much more dangerous for queer people.
For sure.
If I can just add something, your question, Yali, really goes back to that cultural element that I was talking about before. And increasingly, we're seeing queer people being pulled into consumerism, capitalist consumerism. And my hope with the books that we publish is that we can help people to resist that a little bit, and to look at the ways that queer people are existing outside of those spaces and bring that culture into the story, and make that a means to resist the powers that are contributing to climate change.
Heck yes, totally. Sorry, go ahead, Cynthia.
Oh, yeah, I was just going to echo what everyone else had said, especially I think some of Selena's points about being pulled into environment. There's the term like green capitalism or ecofascism, and like learning to sort of focus on the environment in a way that doesn't sort of reproduce our existing systems of inequality. I think something else I just wanted to add is that when climate change well, it's already affecting people, and the people it affects are disproportionately the most vulnerable people, BIPOC, poor people, disabled people, queer people. And these are lives that, as we've seen, just with refugee crises, with what was going on in the Northwest, in the US recently, the heat waves, these are like disposable lives that are not important to the system. And I think there's often a way in which sort of official narratives of productivity and capitalist GB, like whatever, growth, just tend to leave them out. And kind of like, I think something that's really important is maybe giving a little more space to these people who are having real material effects on their lives because of climate crisis.
For sure, totally. For anybody who maybe wants to start dipping their toes into these very complex worlds of sci-fi and fantasy and speculative fiction, do any of you have any advice for those types of emerging writers that are trying to do that?
Okay, I guess I'll just start here. I would say, first of all, like, it's going to be hard, like, if you want to get published, but I think you should really just try to have fun. Like, there's a point in sometimes when I get to, when it comes to writing, where the stress of like, oh no, why haven't I submitted these stories or like done XYZ, it outweighs the reason I started writing in the first place. So like, try to keep that in mind, and like, try to keep the joy that brought you to writing there first. And also, if like, a lot of people just in the mainstream writing world probably aren't going to be as receptive to speculative work, but that's okay, because you can find your own people and like, have a nice group with them as well.
I'd add read widely what's already out there. So even though cli-fi is a relatively new genre, people have been writing in it for decades, and quite a lot of ground has been covered already. And I've worked with some emerging writers, because I'm always trying to support other cli-fi writers. And a lot of times they jump in, their first instinct is to go just like doom and gloom. Like, I need to warn people about what's coming. And first of all, like, I think cli-fi is kind of coalescing around the idea that like doom and gloom, purely doom and gloom, there could be a lot of doom and gloom. Like, there's a lot of doom and gloom in this book, but there has to be some hope and some solutions. And there also has to be some joy in it. Like, even in the worst, horrific post-apocalyptic future, people are going to be laughing with their friends sometimes and like finding those moments of joy. And so I think that reading what's out there will help you with that, with seeing that, and help you see where is your unique perspective useful. Like, for me, there are other great Gulf Coast cli-fi writers, but that was a place really focusing on the Gulf Coast, and the experiences that I've had here are something unique that I can bring to the conversation, along with my transness and my Jewishness. Like, what is your unique perspective that you have on how climate change affects your corner of the world? And I actually have a climate fiction book club that I'll plug on YouTube. We're on Instagram, Climate Fiction Book Club. And so we're trying to like read all the cli-fi to, again, kind of get a sense of what has already been written, and that'll give you a sense of like, where can we push further or bring something new to the conversation. And I do think, to Cynthia's point about just like having fun with it, that speculative fiction really works for writing cli-fi, because the topic is so overwhelming. It can just like fill you with despair, and you don't want to keep writing. And so speculative fiction is like the fun, the candy, the sugar that makes the medicine go down, like, I can write this really, really terrifying book about climate change because it's got dragons in it also, or it's got a ghost in it, So that's what I think about why those genres go so well together.
I will say that for new writers who might be interested in submitting something to Stelliform Press, moving beyond that initial feeling of climate nihilism is really important, as Tim was saying. I mean, I started there with that doom and gloom, but I feel like through reading other people and getting a lot of exposure to what conversations are happening in climate fiction, I have been able to move past that. And that is where you find the joy, and you take your family stories and you figure out how those stories might relate to a climate changed world. And I think that's when things get really interesting, and those are the kinds of stories that we're looking for.
Amazing.
Yeah, and just one last thing for me, I guess, but Sim talked about reading widely, and I think in remembering that there's a tradition of climate fiction, one should also remember that sort of the idea of apocalyptic visions for Black people have been brought to the Americas, for Indigenous people who have been subject to statewide genocidal practices that are still ongoing. Like the apocalypse, there is kind of the refrain that N.K. Jemisin says in a blog post that for certain people, the apocalypse has already happened. And seeing that, like, I think that's very, obviously that's very depressing in terms of people are terrible, but it's also got a glimmer of hope in that there is, like, people do survive. Perhaps, like, there's a lot in really terrible truncated forms of their previous lives and cultures, but there is, survival is possible. And to learn from the people who have already been through what a lot of us who are slightly more privileged are about to face.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes. I love that all of you mentioned about like joy and hope and all of those things. A lot of the climate fiction that I end up loving actually strikes a very hopeful note. So
it's so important. What is the point otherwise, right?
Definitely. Yeah. Speaking of joy and hope, do any of the three of you have any hopes and dreams for the next thing that you're writing? Any things that you're exploring in the future that you haven't explored previously?
I've been getting really into solar punk writing, which is just like pure hope, just utopian writing about how we fix the problems of climate change. And after writing some really dark stuff for years, some dystopian stuff like Depart for years, it's been very freeing, and it was what got me back into writing after like taking a long hiatus during the pandemic. So that's been a lot of fun, and I'm also working on an alternate history that's kind of somewhere in the middle. That's imagining, like, what if Gore had won the 2000 election and the war on climate and the war on terror had never happened, but he enacted like neoliberal solutions and kind of, what if we had like gone all in on corporate greenwash, like corporate green solutions to climate change 20 years ago, and then what would the world look like now? So that's what I'm currently working on.
Very cool.
I'm not quite sure what I'm working on at the moment. I've just been fiddling around with a lot of short stories. In terms of next big projects, I'm not too sure, but I think I would like to maybe return to like the question of queerness and maybe the question of like post-coloniality and or like pushing against Eurocentrism. To that end, I have like a very, very rough embryo of an idea that is about a perfumer and an alchemist in like Opium War era China. And they poison people, I guess, maybe.
Already sounds amazing. I'm sold already.
I was just going to say that Cynthia's just come out of edits and the book just went to print the other day. So I think that she deserves a little break before she goes on to the next thing. In terms of what my hopes and dreams are for the press, I do hope that we can grow to the point where we're consistently reaching readers and people are talking about our stories. And that is already happening. And I'm really excited to push further and reach folks that didn't know how cool a subgenre climate fiction is, and that there's really interesting stuff happening under that label. I also hope to have the privilege to work with more marginalized writers and bring their stories and their experiences with climate and how it affects their lives into that climate conversation, because it is really dominated by white writers from mostly affluent backgrounds. To that end, I would just like to mention that we're opening for submissions for general submissions on September 1st. So there's a bit of time for you to start polishing up your novellas or your novels or even short story collections. We're looking for anything, and I would love to encourage Black, Indigenous, and other people of color to submit to our general call.
That's so exciting. Is there anything that we can do as readers to also uplift and support Stelliform?
Buy some books.
Find books. Amazing. Awesome.
Or I will say also request them at your library, because if you don't have money to spend on books, or maybe you've run out of space like some of us have, you can request them from your library, and then not only you, but lots of other people can read them as well.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's been a wonderful chat. I've had so much fun.
Thank you so much, Yeli.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been great. And
yes, buy the books. Buy the books. All right, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. To find out more about Stelliform Press and to get a copy of Sim and Cynthia's books, visit stelliform.press. This has been today's WOTS Weekly Feature. Tune in next week for Science and Tech Week. For discounts and deals, check out toronto.thewordonthestreet.ca/weekly-features. And from all of us at WOTS, happy reading.